I knew something was wrong long before I heard the words that would change my life forever. My instinct had kicked in, but I ignored it, pretending that everything was fine. After all, we were perfect. That's what everyone said, what she made a point of showing. But perfection is only a fragile illusion, and mine was shattered by a cruel revelation. The woman I loved, with whom I shared my life, was pregnant by my best friend. And her parents, whom I had always treated as a second family, were by their side. I remember exactly the moment when everything fell apart. At first, there was just silence. Then came the whispers, and then the direct, cold and deadly impact. "It's true," she confessed, her voice trembling like a thread about to snap. The betrayal wasn't just a momentary mistake, it was a calculated conspiracy, masked by smiles and hugs. The man I called brother had been by my side all these years, laughing with me, sharing secrets, while secretly plotting to destroy me. "You'd never understand," she said, as if justifying it could erase the knife she had stuck in my back. "It's not about love, it's more complicated than that." Complicated? Complicated is finding out that their whole life was a theater, that while I was working late, dreaming of building something solid for us, they were together, living a romance at my expense. For days, I just listened. I listened to flimsy excuses, soulless explanations. I listened as she talked about regret, as he mumbled something about moments of weakness. "You need to be understanding," they said, as if the betrayal was something trivial, something I should accept in order to keep the peace. Accept it? No. They underestimated me. That's when something in me changed. The shock gave way to an almost frightening clarity. They thought I was weak, that the love I felt for her would prevent me from reacting. But what they didn't know was that I already knew. I was one step ahead the whole time. While they sank into their lies, I accumulated evidence, tracked movements, read messages that they thought would be deleted forever. Every detail was recorded, every piece of evidence saved. I wasn't just going to get revenge, I was going to destroy the house of cards they had built. That's when I announced the divorce. And it wasn't just an announcement, it was a devastating blow. They expected a devastated man, perhaps a desperate plea to get back together. Instead, they received the coldness of the truth. "You'll get nothing," I said, looking directly at her. Her expression changed from guilt to pure panic. "You made your choice, and now you're going to live with the consequences." The silence that followed was as heavy as the words. But that wasn't all. What they didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that I had planned more. They believed that the divorce was the end, but little did they know that it was only the beginning. Because while she mourned the loss of the comfort I had provided, while he tried to save what was left of his life, I still had one last card up my sleeve, something that would ensure they never recovered. And now, with everything underway, I find myself facing a simple but overwhelming question: how far would you go to right an injustice? How far would you go to take revenge on those who destroyed your life? The answer is about to be revealed, but what you discover throughout this story may be darker than you think. After all, revenge is a dish best eaten cold, and mine is being served with surgical precision. If you think you know how this story ends, you're wrong. This is just the beginning. Welcome to our channel. Here, we never support any kind of betrayal. All the stories are fictional, created to show the devastating impact that disloyalty can have on people's lives. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is an intense narrative, full of exciting twists and turns. Take a deep breath, because this story will leave you speechless. Have a good listen. Arthur and Isabel's house was the picture of a successful marriage in the eyes of the world. Situated in a quiet neighborhood, with a white picket fence and a well-kept garden, it seemed the ideal setting for any lasting love story. Arthur, a 38-year-old man, was a disciplined businessman, known for his work ethic and commitment. For him, success was not just a question of skill, but also of dedication. He had built his logistics company from scratch and, although the long working days often kept him away from home, he always believed that he was building a better future for his family. Isabel, at 35, was the complementary opposite. Where Arthur was pragmatic and methodical, she was emotional and spontaneous. She had an easy smile and a charming aura that made everyone around her feel welcome. Isabel was a literature teacher at a local school and dedicated her afternoons to cultivating a small studio at home, where she painted and wrote. Her world was made up of stories, colors and emotions, which often contrasted with Arthur's exact logic. Despite their differences, the two seemed made for each other. They met at a party organized by mutual friends more than a decade ago. Isabel, in her simple blue dress and unpretentious hair, caught Arthur's eye instantly. He, with his neat suit and serious air, looked like the kind of man Isabel usually avoided, but something in his eyes revealed a sweetness she hadn't expected. And so it was that, in the midst of a conversation about classical music, a subject they both discovered they loved, their romance began. The first few years were full of passion and complicity. They used to go for long walks in the evenings, discussing dreams and plans for the future. Isabel clearly remembered Arthur holding her hands on one of these evenings and promising, "No matter what happens, I'll always take care of you." Over the years, the youthful intensity gave way to a solid but predictable partnership. Isabel still admired Arthur's commitment, but deep down she missed a lighter, more adventurous side to him. Arthur, on the other hand, saw Isabel as the light in his life, someone who brought color to his gray days, but often didn't know how to deal with her spontaneity. Routine, inevitable in any marriage, began to shape the relationship. Another important pillar in the couple's life was Lucas, Arthur's best friend since college. Lucas was the kind of person who seemed to light up any room with his natural charisma. He was outgoing, always ready for a joke, and a constant presence at family gatherings and parties organized by the two of them. For Arthur, Lucas was more than a friend, he was like a brother. He trusted his longtime companion completely and often said, "If there's one person in the world I trust as much as I trust myself, it's you." Lucas was also very close to Isabel. She admired his ability to talk about anything, from the news of the day to the latest art exhibitions. Whenever Arthur was stuck in the office, Lucas was the first to show up to help Isabel with anything, from changing a light bulb to helping her carry canvases to the studio. He was a pillar of support for both of them and seemed to fit in perfectly with the family dynamic. Life followed an almost rehearsed rhythm. Arthur worked long hours, but always made a point of making time for family weekends. Friday nights were sacred to them, wines carefully chosen by Arthur, a dinner prepared by Isabel and movies chosen together, usually with heated discussions about which one would be chosen. Even so, there was a silent tension in the air. Small, almost imperceptible things were beginning to alter the dynamic. Isabel, although always loving, seemed more distant at times. She spent more time in the studio, immersed in her canvases and words, as if searching for something that was missing. Arthur noticed, but attributed it to tiredness or Isabel's need to have her own creative space. One sunny afternoon, over lunch in the garden, Isabel commented, "Do you ever feel that something is changing, but you can't understand what?" Arthur frowned, confused, but replied, "I think change is part of life, but what do you mean?" Isabel smiled, looking away. "Nothing much. Just thinking out loud." Arthur was silently proud of having built the life they had, but he was beginning to realize that perhaps the stability he valued so much could be seen as monotony in Isabel's eyes. He loved her deeply, but there was a growing distance that he didn't know how to shorten. The couple's social circle was small, but intimate. Meetings with Isabel's parents were frequent and warm. They had a close relationship, and Isabel always referred to them as her refuge. "My mother always says that marriage is like tending a garden," she used to repeat, "it needs constant attention, or the weeds take over." Arthur respected his parents-in-law, but never saw them as neutral figures. He always felt that their closeness to Isabel was a little invasive, but he never commented on it to avoid friction. He preferred to concentrate on work and making sure everything was financially secure for the future, while Isabel managed the family and social ties. Everything seemed fine, at least on the surface. However, even the calmest waters can hide treacherous currents. Arthur was used to fully trusting the people around him, but at rare moments he questioned whether this made him vulnerable. Isabel, on the other hand, struggled with an inner restlessness that she herself could not explain. That night, as Arthur watched Isabel through the studio window, he felt a weight that he couldn't identify. It was as if something invisible was moving between them, something he couldn't name, but which left a trail of discomfort in his heart. And so their story continued, seemingly solid, but with cracks just beginning to form. They didn't know it yet, but these tiny cracks were about to transform their lives forever. The following weeks brought an air of strangeness to Arthur and Isabel's routine. Small details, previously insignificant, began to take on an unexpected weight. Isabel seemed more distracted, often lost in thought, while Arthur, even immersed in his work, noticed the subtle changes. He knew something wasn't right, but he didn't know how to address it. Silently, he convinced himself that it was just the stress of everyday life. After all, everyone goes through moments like that, don't they? One Friday, however, broke the calm surface of their routine. Lucas arrived at the couple's house for dinner, as he usually did. Isabel was preparing a special dish in the kitchen, while Lucas and Arthur were discussing the results of a recent game in the living room. Everything seemed normal, until Arthur noticed something strange: Isabel's laughter. It was a different kind of laugh, looser, almost intimate. It wasn't the usual laugh she shared with him or her friends. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling that something was out of place stayed with him throughout the night. That same evening, while Lucas was saying goodbye at the door, Arthur noticed an instant between the two of them that made him uneasy. It was a brief, casual touch, but it seemed to contain an intensity that he couldn't understand. Isabel withdrew her hand quickly, smiling, but Arthur felt a chill run up his spine. A few days later, Arthur began to pay more attention. He wasn't the paranoid type, but there was something about the way Isabel behaved around Lucas that made him wonder. It wasn't big gestures or compromising conversations, but small details, glances that lasted a second longer, inside jokes that he didn't understand, and the way Lucas' presence seemed to illuminate Isabel in a way he hadn't seen for months. One afternoon, Arthur decided to leave work early. He wanted to surprise Isabel with a special dinner, a simple gesture to try and rekindle the connection between them. When he parked in the driveway, he noticed that there was another car there. It wasn't unusual for Lucas to drive past the house, but at that moment, his car seemed like an intruding presence. When he went inside, he found Isabel and Lucas in the studio. Isabel was laughing at something Lucas was saying, and they both seemed so at ease that they didn't notice his arrival. "Did I interrupt something?" asked Arthur, in a tone that was meant to be light but carried a latent tension. Isabel looked surprised, but not uncomfortable. "Lucas was helping me with some ideas for the painting," she said, smiling. "You arrived early today." Arthur smiled, but the feeling of displacement persisted. Lucas quickly said goodbye, perhaps a little too quickly, and left the couple alone. As Isabel resumed her routine, Arthur couldn't help feeling that something was being hidden. It was at this point that Arthur began to act. He decided to observe more closely, but discreetly. He installed an app on his phone to monitor messages, something he would never have considered before. It was a gesture of desperation, a sign that his confidence was wearing thin. What he found, at first, was nothing incriminating: casual conversations, full of laughter, but nothing directly suspicious. Still, something was bothering him. One evening, Isabel mentioned that she needed to go out to buy materials for the studio. Arthur offered to accompany her, but she gently refused. "No need," she said, "it's just a quick outing. I'll be back soon." He watched her leave, feeling uncomfortable, but decided not to question it. When she returned hours later, later than expected, she was carrying only a small bag that barely justified the time she had spent away. Days turned into weeks, and Arthur began to notice patterns. Lucas appeared more frequently, often when he wasn't at home. Isabel seemed to avoid certain topics, quickly changing the subject when Arthur asked about her afternoons. Doubts grew like a shadow, but Arthur still had no concrete proof. He wanted to believe that he was wrong, that it was all just a misunderstanding. After all, he had known Lucas for years. They were like brothers. It wasn't possible that he was capable of something like this. Until, one Saturday morning, Arthur found something that confirmed his suspicions. An exchange of messages between Isabel and Lucas, hidden in a secondary app that he had never seen before, made everything clear. The words weren't explicit, but the intimacy between them was evident. "I can't wait to meet you again," said one of Lucas' messages. "I wish we could always be like this," Isabel replied. Arthur felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. His breathing became heavy and he had to sit down. Everything he had built, everything he had fought for, seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. But instead of confronting them immediately, he decided to wait. He wanted to understand how far it would go, he wanted answers. The opportunity came a few days later, when Isabel mentioned that she needed to go out again. This time, Arthur followed her without her noticing. He saw her go into a cafe and, a few minutes later, Lucas joined her. The way they laughed, leaning towards each other, was confirmation of everything. Arthur didn't go in. He stayed outside, watching from a distance, trying to absorb what was happening. When Isabel returned home that evening, Arthur was waiting for her. He stared at her as she put her keys on the table. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm but low. Isabel hesitated, seeming to take the weight of the words. "What about?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Arthur held up his cell phone, showing the exchange of messages between her and Lucas. "About this," he replied, looking directly at her. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabel looked at the floor, then at Arthur, but didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The expression on her face was already a confession. The betrayal was exposed. The breach of trust that Arthur had never imagined facing was now a reality. But as Isabel tried to find the right words, little did she know that Arthur already had something in mind. He wasn't a man who reacted impulsively. He had a plan. The tension in the house was palpable. After the revelation of the betrayal, Isabel had become a restless, almost ghostly presence in Arthur's routine. He, for his part, maintained a cold but non-confrontational posture. That didn't mean he was at peace, on the contrary, his mind was working incessantly. There was something in his calculated calm that made Isabel suspect that the worst was yet to come. And she was right. That evening, while dinner lay untouched on the table, Arthur broke the silence. He was holding an envelope, a small smile on his face, but his eyes revealed something darker. "I think it's time we put everything on the table," he said, his voice low but loaded with meaning. Isabel stopped chewing, putting down her fork. "What do you mean?" she asked, apprehension running through her words. Arthur opened the envelope and threw it on the table. Inside were printouts of messages exchanged between her and Lucas, photos of meetings they thought were secret and documents that, at first glance, seemed disconnected. Isabel's eyes widened, the air trapped in her lungs. "How long did you think this would go on without me finding out?" Arthur asked, without raising his voice, but with a firmness that made Isabel shiver. I don't know what to say," she muttered, looking away. The weight of the humiliation was almost unbearable, but there was more in that envelope than just evidence of the affair. Arthur continued, "You betrayed me, Isabel. Not just as a wife, but as a partner. And you had the audacity to think that I wouldn't notice? That I would simply accept the facade you and Lucas have built up? Arthur, please." "I know I made a mistake," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a moment of weakness. Arthur laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Weakness is forgetting to buy milk at the supermarket. What you did was a choice. You destroyed everything we built together, and you didn't even have the courage to be honest about it. Isabel began to cry, but Arthur didn't move to console her. His expression remained still, almost indifferent. He stood up and walked over to the window, his hands folded behind his back. The silence between them was piercing. "Do you know what hurts me most about all this?" he asked, finally turning to face her. "It's not the betrayal itself, but the fact that you thought I was foolish enough not to see it. You and Lucas thought you could play games with me." Isabel shook her head in despair. "It's not like that, Arthur. I never wanted it to be like this." "Oh, but it was," he said, returning to the table and picking up another envelope, bigger this time. He threw it on the table, making Isabel cringe. "Do you know what's in here?" "They're legal documents. Divorce, of course. But before you start making plans to divide up what we have, let me clarify something." Isabel looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Arthur opened the second envelope and spread the contents out on the table: contracts, bank records, and a prenuptial agreement that Isabel hadn't seen since the beginning of the marriage. "All this here guarantees that you won't see a penny of what's mine." "The house?" "It's in my name, before we got married." "The company?" "Needless to say, right." "And the joint accounts?" "Well, there's nothing left in them. I transferred everything to my personal account. Legally, it's untouchable." Isabel stood paralyzed, her eyes roaming over the documents as if they might somehow disappear. You planned this?" she asked incredulously. Arthur nodded, a bitter smile on his lips. "From the moment I began to suspect. While you were having fun with Lucas, I was getting ready. And you know what's best? I did it all within the law. There's nothing you can do to dispute it." "That's cruel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Cruel?" Arthur laughed again. "Cruel is what you did to me. You didn't just betray my trust, you made me look like an idiot. And now, you're going to reap what you've sown." Before Isabel could reply, the doorbell rang. Arthur didn't need to look to know who it was. He walked to the door and opened it. Lucas was there, with an expression that oscillated between regret and defiance. "We need to talk," said Lucas, trying to keep his composure. "Indeed we do," replied Arthur, opening the door for him to enter. When Lucas entered the room and saw Isabel crying, his countenance changed. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice a little louder than necessary. Arthur walked over to the table and picked up the documents again. "What's happening, Lucas, is that the game is over. I know everything. The messages, the meetings, even the ridiculous plans you made." "Arthur, you need to understand," Lucas began, trying to sound reasonable. "It wasn't something planned. It just happened. Planned or not, you did it. You betrayed the one person who was always there for you, who trusted you like a brother," said Arthur, his voice laced with contempt. "And now you're going to bear the consequences." Lucas looked at Isabel, who avoided his gaze, and then turned to Arthur. "I know I made a mistake, but, can't we sort this out some other way?" Arthur was silent for a moment, just watching Lucas. Then, with a cold smile, he replied, "You still don't understand, do you? I've already sorted it out. Everything you and Isabel thought you were hiding is here," he said, pointing to the documents. "And the best part? You'll both come out of this with nothing but the shame you deserve." The room fell silent, except for the muffled sound of Isabel's sobs. Arthur, with nothing more to say, turned and left the room, leaving the two of them alone to deal with the ruins of what they had done. But as he climbed the stairs, there was something else they didn't yet know. Something he had kept to himself, and which was about to be revealed in a way that no one could have predicted. The house was silent, but it was the kind of silence that pulsed with the tension of unspoken words and exposed truths. Arthur climbed the stairs, leaving Lucas and Isabel in the living room. Each step was heavy, not because of physical fatigue, but because of the emotional weight of everything that had just unfolded. However, he didn't allow himself to weaken. There was a dark satisfaction in seeing the plan executed with precision, but at the same time, an emptiness began to set in. Downstairs, Isabel still held the documents in her hands. Her eyes searched the printed words as if hoping to find some mistake, a loophole that would undo everything. Lucas, on the other hand, paced the room restlessly, trying to find something to say, but it was clear that any argument he could come up with would be too flimsy for this moment. "Did you know about this?" Lucas finally asked, stopping in front of Isabel. His tone was more accusatory than supportive. Isabel looked up, tears streaming silently down her face. "Of course I didn't know," she replied, her voice shaking. "I never imagined he would do something like this." "You never really knew him," Lucas retorted, his tone bitter. "Arthur is calculating. He doesn't forgive." Isabel looked away, feeling the guilt and regret building up in her mind like a storm. "Do you think he hates me?" she asked, almost in a whisper. Lucas let out a frustrated sigh. "After all that? I don't know if hate is enough to describe what he feels now." Meanwhile, upstairs, Arthur locked himself in the room he had once shared with Isabel. With every object around him, he saw reflections of a past that now seemed like a lie. The photos of happy trips, her perfume still hanging in the air, the bed that once symbolized comfort was now a bitter reminder of betrayal. He picked up his cell phone and opened the messages from Lucas and Isabel again. He didn't need to read them, he already knew what was there. But it was as if seeing those words helped him keep alive the determination to go ahead with the plan. Anger was still his ally, but now it was mixed with something darker, doubt. Arthur went downstairs later that evening and found Lucas sitting on the sofa, his head between his hands. Isabel was next to him, but there was a noticeable distance between them. On seeing Arthur, Lucas immediately stood up. "We need to talk," he said, his voice laden with urgency. "You have nothing more to say that interests me," replied Arthur, his voice firm and controlled. "The only reason you're still here is because I wanted you to see the consequences of what you did." "Arthur, that was a mistake," Lucas began, trying to contain his frustration. "I never wanted it to come to this. You have every right to be angry, but we can fix this." "Fix it?" Arthur let out a bitter laugh. "You think you can fix years of broken trust with a few words? There is no fixing here, Lucas. There are only consequences." Lucas took a step forward, but Arthur raised his hand, interrupting him. "Enough," he said, his tone icy. "I don't want to hear any more. Get out of my house. Now." Lucas hesitated, looking at Isabel, as if seeking some kind of support, but she just looked away. Defeated, he picked up his coat and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned to Arthur. "You may hate me for the rest of your life, but know one thing, I never meant to hurt you." Arthur didn't reply. He just stood there, watching as Lucas left, closing the door behind him. The room fell silent again. Isabel tried to speak, but Arthur raised his hand once more. "I don't want to hear your excuses. Not now." He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water and stood there, staring at nothing. Isabel remained in the living room, feeling smaller and smaller under the weight of her guilt. The following days were filled with a tense calm. Arthur avoided Isabel whenever possible, spending more time in his office or locked in his room. When they were in the same room, communication was minimal, reduced to short, emotionless words. Isabel tried a few times to get closer, but each attempt was met with a look that made her retreat. On Friday evening, Arthur arrived home later than usual. Isabel was in the studio, sitting in front of a blank canvas, but unable to paint anything. She heard Arthur's footsteps in the hallway and felt her heart race. He entered the studio, something he hadn't done for weeks. "I need an answer," he said, his voice low but firm. Isabel turned slowly to face him. "Why?" The question was simple, but loaded with meaning. Isabel felt the tears coming back. "I don't know," she replied, her voice breaking. I don't know what went wrong. I was lost. I felt that something was missing, and Lucas was there, listening to me. Arthur remained silent for a long moment. And me? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. I was here, Isabel. I've always been here. I know, she replied, sobbing. And that's what makes it worse. Arthur shook his head, his face a mask of disappointment and pain. There's nothing more to say, he said at last. I've already made my decision. Before leaving the studio, he stopped at the door and looked at her one last time. You're going to have to learn to live with the choices you've made. And so will I. That night, while Isabel cried alone, Arthur prepared to take the final step in his plan. But there was something he hadn't yet revealed, something that would change everything forever. The silence that enveloped the house over the next few weeks was almost as suffocating as the recent confrontations. Arthur didn't bother to hide his distance from Isabel, he had emotionally ended the relationship. Isabel, for her part, lived in a state of constant tension, between tears and regret, knowing that the destruction she herself had caused was irreparable. Then, one morning, the unexpected happened. Isabel was woken by the sound of an insistent doorbell. She went downstairs hesitantly, fearing what it might be, and found Lucas at the door. His appearance was very different. He looked haggard, with deep-set eyes and an untrimmed beard. He entered uninvited, his expression charged with urgency. Isabel, we need to talk, he said, his voice low and almost trembling. She took a step back, surprised by his insistence. I have nothing to say to you, Lucas, she replied, trying to keep control. Do you think Arthur will stop here? He asked, ignoring her resistance. Not only did he end your relationship, he's also ruining my life. Isabel stared at him, confused. What do you mean? Lucas ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. Arthur went further. He used his influence to cut me out of all my contracts. My accounts are blocked. I can't even pay next month's rent. He paused, looking at Isabel. What about you? Has he started with you yet? Lucas' question hit Isabel like a blow. She hadn't noticed anything in her financial life, yet. But what Arthur had said weeks ago about leaving her nothing echoed in her mind. He was already at work, slowly dismantling everything they knew. However, Isabel knew she couldn't hide behind excuses. What was happening was a direct consequence of her choices. Lucas, you knew the risk. You knew what we were doing, she said, her voice fragile. And now we're paying for it. Lucas stared at her, the desperation clear in his eyes. I need help. We can't let him win like this. But Isabel shook her head, backing away. I can't get involved in this anymore. I can't, with you anymore. It was the first time she had put into words what she had been feeling since the confrontation. The weight of the betrayal, the guilt and the emptiness between her and Lucas now seemed unbearable. The man who had once seemed like an escape was now a reminder of what she had lost. Lucas, realizing he was alone, let out a heavy sigh and left, leaving Isabel on the doorstep, feeling the morning chill as a reflection of her loneliness. Meanwhile, Arthur was in a lawyer's office. He was holding a document, going over each line carefully. It was the finalization of the divorce proceedings, a definitive end that he had been waiting for with calculated patience. I want everything to be concluded quickly, he told the lawyer. I want her to understand that there's no going back. The lawyer nodded. Everything is prepared. As soon as Isabel signs, it will be closed. Arthur took the papers and left the office with firm steps. At another time, he would have felt sadness or regret, but now there was only a strange tranquility. He had closed a chapter and was ready to move on, but not without ensuring that Isabel would face the consequences of her choices. He left the documents at the house that evening, hand-delivered. Isabel opened the door and saw Arthur standing outside, papers in hand. It's all here, he said, without emotion. Read it, sign it and give it back. Isabel took the papers, but hesitated. Arthur, please, we need to talk. He shook his head. There's nothing more to be said, Isabel. Everything that needs to be said has already been said. She tried to hold his hand, but he pulled back. I know I made a mistake. I know I hurt you. But please, don't let it end like this. Not with so much hatred. Arthur stared at her for a long moment before replying. You don't understand, Isabel. It's not hate. It's the end. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone, holding the papers that symbolized the definitive end of everything they had built. A few days later, Lucas was seen leaving town. His life had completely fallen apart. With no job, no allies, he left everything behind in search of a fresh start elsewhere. But even as he left, he knew it wouldn't be easy to escape the consequences of what he had done. Isabel, on the other hand, decided to stay in the house for a while. She stopped painting, stopped going out. Her life became a succession of meaningless days, filled only with regret. The smiles that once lit up the room were now just memories. Arthur, however, began to rebuild his life in a different way. He devoted himself even more to work, but he also found time to rediscover simple pleasures. A walk in the park, dinner alone in a quiet restaurant. He knew that he would still bear the marks of betrayal, but he also knew that he had won. Not because he ruined others, but because he refused to be defeated. The story came to an end, not with easy reconciliations or pardons, but with a sense of raw, inescapable justice. Each of those involved received exactly what their choices had brought them. There were no winners, only survivors, each dealing with the consequences of their actions. And now we want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Share your opinion in the comments. Your feedback is very important to us. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't miss the chance to follow more stories like this one. Remember, here, we never support betrayal, because it always leaves deep and irreparable scars. See you next time.